Chapter 46 of Lord Montagu's Page by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 46. The Prince de Soubise stood at the window of the library of Applethorpe alone, for Edward had made an excuse to leave him, not thinking himself bound to play the host in a house which was not his, nor to act as the entertainer of a man whom he had some good cause, as he thought, to dislike. Soubise was then past 40, however, and he did not, as indeed who does in middle life, look upon trifles with the serious view which one takes of them in earlier years. Hasty and quick in quarrel applies to small as well as great things, and heaven knows how much patience we acquire each day by the mere habit of endurance. He received the young man's apology in good part then, and while Edward Langdale went to speak to every old servant, and then to change his travel-stained dress, he stood, as I have said, at the window, and gazed forth upon a scene to be viewed in no other country under the sky, a home scene of English life. It is probably of no age, of no time, for it is an impress of the mind and character of the people. But I must not dwell upon it. The chapter of descriptions has gone by. Soubise gazed out, compared that which was before his eyes with that on which they might have rested in his own country, admired what he saw, and, perhaps, in the desponding mood which certainly then affected him, felt sorry that France had not so calm, so peaceful, and so happy a look as an English country village. After he had continued gazing for some 10 minutes upon the road before him, appeared an elderly man upon a fine stout horse, with clerical hat and cassock turned up, and a servant following him on a still better beast. They both rode fast. Though the first sat his steed somewhat after the fashion of a sack of wheat, it was clear that the saddle was quite familiar to him, and the slouching shoulders and negligent air were more the consequences of perfect ease and habit than of awkwardness. The servant pulled back the gate, his master dashed through, and in a moment after Dr. Winthorne was at the door. The old footman ran forth to give him entrance, and a few words passed, of which Soubise only heard the words, "Ned come back? Tell the dear fellow to come down." A stranger? Well, we must see strangers. And the door of the library opened. Dr. Winthorne gazed at Soubise, and the prince at him, without any sign of recognition as they approached each other. But suddenly the reverend gentleman stopped, exclaiming, "God bless you, Monsieur Soubise! On my life, sir, I am glad to see you. When did you come over? How fares it with you? You are older by a good deal, but you look well. Am I right?" "I am right. Surely the Prince de Soubise." "The same, my good friend," said the prince. "I am not surprised you doubt, for I feel I am much changed. It is 10 long years since we met, and with me they have been stormy years." "So I have heard," said the good doctor, "though news travels but slowly in our poor country. But I have watched your noble struggles as closely as I could, and I have felt great interest in them all, though you, every one of you, make great mistakes. And now Rochelle is lost. God help us! It is a sad case, but she could hold out no longer, and that Mayor Guiton is a noble man." "He is indeed," said Soubise, "and his character has risen in my opinion by what has been told me by a young gentleman who came hither with me." "Odds my life!" cried the old doctor. "My boy, Ned Langdale. I must go, Prince, I must go and hug him. Sir, he is as fine a youth as ever lived, and ought to be a great man. God send he may escape it. But I have not seen him yet. Excuse me, I will be back in a minute. Make yourself at home. All shall be prepared for you before you can say Amen." With this somewhat unconnected speech, Dr. Winthorne left the room, and in a few minutes returned with Edward Langdale, who allowed himself to be introduced to the prince with cold ceremony. "He says," observed Dr. Winthorne, "that somehow you have not treated him well. But we will talk of that after supper. Everything should be explained between all people, but no explanation should take place fasting. The humours are then in a bad condition, and as there is no chance in my house of people heating them by potations, we will just calmly regulate them by wholesome food and moderate drink, and then have a clear understanding." "I am perfectly unconscious," said the prince, but the doctor cut him short, exclaiming, after supper, my lord. Your apartments are quite ready. Let me conduct you. The old clergyman and the Protestant prince retired from the room, and Dr. Winthorne was nearly half an hour absent. When he returned, however, he shook Edward once more warmly by the hand, saying, "Why, Ned, my boy, you are grown quite a man. Heaven show us mercy. You have a beard an ell long. But now tell me all that has happened to you. As to this man upstairs, he is a good man, a very good man, hasty but noble and generous, steady in his friendships, true to his cause. There is some mistake between you and him. He says your brother Richard wrote to him, or visited him, or something, and he might have treated him with some indignity, but he never saw or heard of you in his life till last night, when he met you at an inn." Edward smiled, saying he must have a short memory. "Well, well," said Dr. Winthorne, "we will have it all after supper. Now tell me everything you have done and seen and suffered, for I doubt not you have suffered too, my poor boy. We shall have plenty of time if this prince takes as long to bedizen himself as he used to. He was a mighty fop in other years, but he has a more soldier-like look now. Well, Ned, give me the whole story." Edward Langdale willingly enough related succinctly what had befallen him since he parted from the good doctor nearly 2 years before. There was a good deal, indeed, he did not tell, for he knew that the explanations required would be too long for the limited space before him. Indeed, before even the abbreviated narrative was brought to a close, the Prince de Soubise joined them, and they retired into another chamber to supper. The meal passed over in great cheerfulness. The wine was good, and of that quality which parsons loved in those days, but all partook moderately, and as soon as the servants had withdrawn, for supper at that period of the world's history was served with very nearly the same forms as dinner in the present times, Soubise bowed his head to Edward Langdale, saying, in not very good English, "There must be some mistake between us, sir. I should like to have it set right, for your father was one of my dearest friends. We travelled long together with this worthy minister, and I wish much to remove anything like coldness between myself and his son." "I really do not know, Monsieur de Soubise," said Edward in French, "what mistake there can be. But may I ask if in June of last year you did not write a letter to your brother, the Duke de Rohan, in which you styled me an insolent varlet?" "The Duke sent me the letter, and my eyes, I think, cannot have deceived me." "No, no," cried Soubise. "Stay, let me remember. I applied that term," he continued more slowly, "to Sir Richard Langdale, your father's eldest son, who, as I have been told, and as I have still reason to believe, has robbed you of your property, of your mother's as well as your father's inheritance. To the latter he might have some claim, even that is doubtful. To the former he had none." "Unfortunately, by the laws of this country, he had," said Edward. "But all this is past and over, and—" "Stay, stay," said Soubise, interrupting him. "It is not all over yet. It is the very cause of my coming here. I was a witness, sir, to the marriage contract, or settlement, as you call it here, I believe, between your father and your mother, by which it was agreed that all the property she possessed, not only at the time, but which might descend to her from her uncle, should belong to her and descend to her children. In his last letter, when he thought himself dying, good old Clement Tournon informed me that this very property had been taken from you by him whom I may well call your base-born brother. Having done all that I had to do, and been disappointed in all, having seen the noble Buckingham die at my feet, and borne the loss of Rochelle, my first business was to come on here to see right done if it could be done." "There, Edward, there," said Dr. Winthorne. "I told you he was noble and true." "I doubted it not, my dear friend," replied Edward, "but still the words his highness used were somewhat galling." "They were never applied to you, upon my honour," said the prince, "as far as I recollect now, for it was a time of great hurry and confusion. I had heard that Richard Langdale, whose whole history I knew as well as my daily service, was at the court of France soliciting some place from his majesty. My brother wrote to me, mentioning only Monsieur de Langdale. Probably it was to you he referred. Probably he was deceived as well as myself, although he did not know so much of the circumstances as I did. My cousin left his child with his dying breath to my child, enjoining me strictly to have her educated in the Protestant faith, and never to suffer her to fall into the hands—" "What!" exclaimed Dr. Whinthorn, interrupting him. "Dear child! Little Lucette! How is the sweet? Where is she? Oh, that I could see her again for an hour, for she was an angel. Do you remember, Edward, that you once had a little sister, and that when you were ill of fever she disappeared?" "Was that Lucette?" exclaimed Edward. "Remember her, my dear sir? Oh, yes, but how can that be? Her death killed my mother, I think. Lucette, my sister?" And he gazed down upon the table with a bewildered mind and a chilly, painful feeling at the heart, such as he never had experienced in life before. "I cannot comprehend," he added. "Lucette, my sister not dead." "No, no," said Dr. Whinthorn. "Tell him all, my lord the prince. Lucette is not your sister. She merely passed as such. Your father and your mother took her in very early years to hide her from her Roman Catholic relations in France, out of love and friendship for this noble gentleman. Those relations were powerful here as well as in the neighbouring country, and at length they discovered where she was. But Monsieur de Soubise came over and removed her, first to the town of Brixham, where she remained some years, and thence to France. I had some share in all this, too. But you are mistaken, my son, about your mother's death. She grieved to lose her little pet, and wept often and bitterly at her loss. But the origin of her illness was a terrible fire which consumed your father's house when you were very young. Then exposure and injuries received before she could escape sowed the seeds of that sad malady which, in this land of ours, like death's gardener, culls the sweetest and most beautiful flowers to decorate the grave." "Then she is not my sister?" exclaimed Edward. "She is not dead? Thank God for that." It might be difficult for those who heard it to know which he thanked God for most, and the exclamation produced a slight smile upon the countenance of Dr. Whinthorn. "Methinks, Prince," he said, "this young man must have met Lucette since. You dog, you told me nothing of that." But the Prince de Soubise was very grave. "Let us not talk of that part of the subject to-night," he said. "I fear there are painful conclusions before us. But, Mr. Langdale, my friendship for your father and my deep gratitude to your saintly mother make me most anxious to see you reinstated in her fine property. Let us consult what can be done. I am here ready to swear I signed the deed as witness with my own hand." "That will not be sufficient," said Dr. Whinthorn, with somewhat of a smile on his countenance. "In this land we shall require the deed itself. But let us ride over to-morrow to Buckley and see our old friend Sykes, the hunchbacked attorney, for I cannot help thinking that he knows something more than he will tell me. For the last 6 months he has been keeping up the place at his own expense, for I dare say you have heard, Edward, that no one has known anything of Sir Richard for more than 12 months. He draws no rents, sends over no orders. His lawyer here has written and sent to Turin, but no intelligence whatever can be procured, and many people think that he is dead." "It is very strange," said the Prince de Soubise, "but I have no belief in the report of his death. Most likely he is wandering somewhere, and does not wish the place of his abode to be known. He was always very eccentric." "Then you know him, my lord?" said Edward, who had not lately mingled in the conversation, for some words which had fallen from Soubise had saddened him. "I have not seen him for many years," replied the prince, "but even then he was as strange a boy as I ever saw. There was insanity in the family of his mother, and some people thought that the child would grow up an idiot. It was not so, however, though he was very strange. This strangest never reached to madness. Fits of moody gloom would come upon him, and he often would not speak a word for hours. If he did, it would be with a bitter and supercilious tone, very extraordinary in a mere child. Then again, at times, he would fly into the most violent fits of passion, and then sink into melancholy. The way I learned all this is easily explained. At your father's request I took some charge of him after his mother's death in the convent, but his behaviour became so bad that I had to relinquish the trust." "You applied to him a short time since," said Edward, "a somewhat hard and unpleasant expression. You said that you might almost call him base born. Is it too much to ask that you would give me some information on that point?" "I know not well how to explain," replied Soubise, looking down thoughtfully. His mother was a very light Italian woman of a low, bad race. Your father married her, beyond doubt, before this child was born, but it was only just before, and that with half a dozen stilettos at his throat, for they caught him alone with her and forced the marriage. Almost as soon as it was over, he separated from her, and she went into a convent. Her relations spreading absurd stories that they had caused the separation because your father was a Protestant. This gained them some favour at the court of Rome, and one of them obtained advancement in the church, where, after leading a very dissolute life, he was struck with remorse and retired into the most austere seclusion. This is nearly all I know of the matter, but it was this knowledge of the young man's birth, character, and connections which made me use the term insolent varlet, which gave you so much offence. I pledge you my honour, however, it was not intended for you, and I should not have applied it, probably, to him, had I not been in haste and irritated at the moment. Then I hope, my good lord, replied Edward, that, as the expression was not applied to me, I may look upon all the sentiments and resolutions contained in that letter as unsaid also? Do not press me to-night, said Soubise very gravely. I am afraid if I speak now, my reply will pain you. The house of Rohan is a proud house, and I have much to think of. Give me a few days for reflection, and I will meet you fairly. But in the meantime, let us be friends. Your father was the companion of my youth, and my most intimate associate. Your mother, now a saint in heaven, was an angel upon earth, and I would fain have her son's regard. As he spoke, he held out his hand to the young man, who took it respectfully, and shortly after the prince retired to rest. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47 of Lord Montagu's Page by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 47. Though those days were of splendid cavalcades, and the neighbourhood of the royal place of Royston had rendered them not infrequent some years before in that part of Huntingdonshire, it was not often that such a party presented itself in the small village of Buckley as that which was seen on the day after Edward's arrival. First, there was Dr. Winthorne, on his tall, stout, Roman-nosed horse, forming the centre of the group. Then, on his left, Edward Langdale, riding a wicked, fiery devil, which screamed and bit at the approach of any other animal, but which he managed with grace and ease. Then there was the Prince de Soubise on the doctor's right, mounted on a powerful Norman charger, and looking very much the soldier and the prince. Behind them were 3 servants, all well mounted and armed, and the whole formed a group which attracted the attention of the villagers, and made even the blacksmith suspend the blows of his sledge-hammer to look at the fine horses he longed to shoe. There was a little old dusty house on the right-hand side of the road as you came from Applethorpe toward the King's Highway to Huntingdon, with the gables turned toward the street, a wooden porch carved in curious shapes, and some 5 or 6 descending steps. On one of the pillars of the porch was hung a curious sort of shield painted with various colours, a quaint emblem of the Holy Roman Empire, and underneath was written, with no great regard to symmetry either in the size or shape of the letters, the words Martin Sykes, Notary Public, Attorney at Law, Solicitor in His Most Gracious Majesty's Court of Chancery, etc., 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 which etceteras were explained and commented upon by a long inscription on the other pillar. Before that little porch Dr. Winthorne pulled in his rein and floundered off his horse, and Soubise and Edward Langdale followed. In the first room on the left hand they found 3 or 4 clerks, and at a separate desk, which he could not have overtopped without assistance, was seated a little old man with very keen features and a back and chest which assumed a menacing posture in regard to the head. "Ah, doctor," he said, slipping off the very high stool which raised him up to the desk, "what brings you so early to Buckley? Odds my life, why I can hardly believe my eyes. Master Ned grown into a bearded man of war. My dear boy, how are you? Oh, how I have missed you. Missed the trout in the month of May, missed the partridges in September, missed the snipes and the woodcocks in the cold weather, when I have my annual abscess in the lungs. Missed thy handsome face at all those times when a kind word in a youthful voice cheers an old man like me. Edward shook him warmly by the hand, and asked after all his ailments kindly, but speedily turned to their companion, saying, "Mr. Sikes, this is the Prince de Soubise, an old friend of both my parents." "I remember him well," said Mr. Sikes. "That is to say, I do not remember him at all. I mean in person I do not remember him, for he might as well be Goliath of Gath as Prince de Soubise, so far as any identification on my part could go. But I remember quite well a young gentleman of that name, in purfled silk philomote velvet, laced with gold, slashed velvet breeches, and a sword as long as a barbecuing spit by his side, being present at your father's wedding and witnessing the marriage contract." "He has got me exactly," said Monsieur de Soubise. "I have had, Mr. Notary, to take lighter but more serviceable weapons since, but if my person is so much changed that you cannot remember me, there are plenty of witnesses here to swear to whom I am, and I expect in a few days my good friend Monsieur Clement Tournon, syndic of the goldsmiths of Rochelle, who made and brought over a set of jewels for my friend's bride, and who saw me witness the contract with his own eyes. He remembers the whole deed, he says, for it was read over to us before the signature." "He will be an important witness, sir," said Martin Sikes, "and your highness will be more so. It is all coming right, as I thought it would," he continued, turning to Dr. Winthorn and rubbing his thin, bony hands. "Somewhat long we have been about it, but step by step we are making way. Everything takes time, doctor, even a sermon, as the poor people here know well. The great difference between a lawsuit and a sermon is, that during the first the people sleep often and sleep badly, and during the second they sleep once and they sleep well. Now, Master Ned, I calculate that we shall get to the end of this suit and have a decree in our favour. Let me see, you are about 20, are not you? In about 49 years and 7 months. He paused a single instant and rubbed his hands, and then added with a smile slightly triumphant, "That is to say, if we cannot get the original settlement. But I think we shall get it, Ned, my boy. I think I can guess where it is. It is most likely badly damaged, but just give me sufficient of it left to show some of the signatures and the date, and then come in these gentlemen as witnesses to prove what it originally contained. Oh, we will make a fine little case of it. But parties, we want parties, somebody to fight us, Master Ned." "But if the fight is to last so long as you have said, my dear friend," remarked Edward Langdale, "and I am only to succeed when I am 69 years and 7 months old, I think I had better not begin the battle." "Ay, but you forget the if," said Martin Sikes with a laugh, "and if makes everything in law. It is as potent as anything hereinbefore contained to the contrary notwithstanding, or always provided nevertheless, or any other of those sweet phrases with which we double up the sense of our documents, or give a sweet and polite contradiction to what we have just been saying the moment before. As to the battle, my dear young friend, it has begun already. Acting on your behalf as your next friend, I have managed to get possession of Buckley. I have served Sir Richard's lawyer and agent with all sorts of processes, some 16 or 17, I think, ejectments, quo warrantos, rules nisi, and others, and the poor fool, who's nothing at all unless he has a Londoner at his back, has let me have very nearly my own way, having no orders, not knowing where to get any, and standing like a goose under the first drops of a thunder shower, with his eyes staring and his mouth half open." "But where is the contract?" asked Monsieur de Soubise in French. "If I understood him aright, he said he knew where it was." Edward interpreted, feeling very sure that good Mr. Sikes was not very abundantly provided with French. But the little lawyer shook his head, saying, "No, no, I did not profess to know absolutely where it is, but there is one not very far from here who I think does know. I think he does. I am sure he does. He tells me a box of valuable papers were lost at the Great Fire, and he shakes his head, and looks wise, and talks of it being made worth his while. He is the most avaricious old devil in the world. It is a curious thing, Ned, all sextons are avaricious. They deal so much with dust and ashes that they learn to like the only sort of dross which does not decay when you bury it. He is a very old man now, and could not enjoy for more than a few months anything he had, were it millions." "What, you are not speaking of the old sexton at Langley, are you?" asked Edward. "The man with the lame hip. He used to say he got that injury at the fire, and my father gave him many a guinea for it. I used to give him shillings and sixpences too, to make him tell me all about the fire, till one day I caught him taking away a groat I had given to a poor child, and then I knocked him over the shoulder with my fishing rod. He has never liked me after, but hobbles away into his cottage whenever he sees me, and shuts the door tight." What there was in this little anecdote which peculiarly struck good Mr. Sikes I cannot tell, but he fell into a fit of thought, still standing, for there were no chairs in the room except one which had lost a leg, in what action I do not know, and the high stools on which the clerks were sitting, if they could be called chairs. He kept a finger of his right hand resting on the side of his nose, however, for 2 or 3 minutes, and then, suddenly rousing himself, he said, "Let us go into the house. We can sit down there and talk. This is a poor place for such company. It does well enough for roistering farmers' sons who have been breaking each other's heads, or for a deputy tax collector, or for gossiping women who have been slandering and being slandered. I don't want them to sit down at all, and that is the reason I have only one chair with a broken leg, to which I always hand old Mistress Skillet, the doctor's widow, who abuses every young girl in the place who has got a pretty face and wears a pink ribbon. Then down she comes and declares she has broken her hip bone, and walks away in great indignation, never coming back until she has another peck of lies upon her stomach. I must not do it any more, for she has grown as large as an elephant, and the last time she tumbled she had nearly shaken the office down. Besides, it cost me 2 ounces of peppermint to bring all those boys there out of their convulsions. But come, gentlemen, let us go." Thus saying, he led the way through a little door at the back of the office, across a small passage, into an exceedingly neat old-fashioned parlour, where, having seated his guests, he rushed at a corner cupboard and brought forth some tall stalked cut and gilded wine-glasses, and a square-sided bottle, likewise cut and gilded, from which he pressed his visitors to help themselves. Monsieur de Soubise remarked it was too early to drink wine, but the old man pressed them, saying, "It is not wine at all. It is fine old Dutch cinnamon," and each having taken a little, good Mr. Sikes leaned his arms upon the table, remarking, "Now this looks really like the commencement of a conspiracy, and a conspiracy we must have. I have settled it all. We must go over to the old place, that is, Old Langley Court, Prince. I will enact my own character. The doctor here is too reverent to undergo transformation. You, my noble sir, must be a French nobleman about to buy Langley Court, and Buckley too, in fact half the estates in the neighbourhood. Edward here must be your cornet of horse, there'll be no need to mention his name, but the old wretch, who is as sharp as Satan, will most likely know him. He is aware, however, that Master Ned has been over in the wars in France, so the story will go down." "It seems to me, my good friend Sikes," said Dr. Winthorne, "that you are going to tell a vast quantity of lies. Mark you now, I will have nothing to do with them. I don't even know that I ought to stand by and hear them." "You shall not hear a lie come out of my mouth," said Sikes, laughing. "My lord the Prince, I dare say you are willing enough to buy Langley Court and the estate, if I will sell it to you for a gold crown. What you call in France an écu d'or?" "Oh, very willingly," answered Soubise. "This cinnamon is worth an écu d'or," and he helped himself to some more. "Well, then, I will sell you the whole estate for that sum, if ever I can prove my title to it," said Sikes. "It is a bargain. Now, Dr. Winthorne, do not you by any scruples spoil your young friend's only chance, if you would not have us take you for a cropped-eared Puritan instead of a good old sound Church of England man? Well, then, don't you lie too much, Mr. Attorney. I will swallow as much as I can, but keep within bounds, or you may chance to find me break out." "All you have to do is hold your tongue. I will do all the speaking," replied Sikes. "The Prince here may talk as much French as ever he likes, and Master Ned may answer him in the same tongue. I will answer for it that neither old Grimes the sexton, nor Martin Sikes the lawyer, will be a bit the wiser for it." "But when is this to be done?" asked Dr. Winthorne. "We have ridden 10 miles already to-day." "Well," said Mr. Sikes, "if we go over by the Barford road, that is but 10 miles, and then we can go to Applethorpe, where you intend to give me a bed. That is but 9 miles more. You would not mind going 30 miles any day for a fox hunt?" "I never go fox hunting, grumbled Dr. Winthorne. "No, but you used once," said Mr. Sikes, and bearing down all opposition, being strongly supported, it must be owned, by Edward and the Prince de Soubise, Mr. Sikes carried his point, ordered his own easy-going cob to be brought round, and had a bag fixed to the saddle with such little articles of dress as he wanted. When the four gentlemen issued forth into the street to proceed upon their way, a certain rosiness of Piero's nose, which, together with some dewy drops in his eye, gave his face somewhat the aspect of a morning landscape, induced Edward to believe that he had been engaged in the pious employment of breaking a good resolution. But Piero declared manfully that he had only been following his young master's orders with his French companion. "You told me to treat them hospitably, sir," he said, "and how can I treat them hospitably without drinking with them?" Edward gave him a caution to keep himself sober at all events, and on they went some 9 miles upon their way at a brisk pace. "Now," said Sikes, as they approached the old park wall, which had fallen down in several places, "we won't go nearer the old rascal. We must be perfectly indifferent." "I recollect this park well," said the Prince de Soubise. "What a splendid place it was before the fire." "Hush, hush!" cried Sikes. "That is English." And riding on, he pulled up his horse at a spot where some cottages were built between the road and the river, just fronting the old iron gates of what was called the Grass Court, beyond which, some 200 yards off, appeared the blackened ruins of Langley. The walls were all down, at least those of the main building, for not only had the fire overthrown them, but the pick and shovel had been busy for several weeks after the catastrophe, turning over the principal ruins in search of plate and other articles of value which had not been carried out during the fire. There the gentlemen dismounted, the servants tied the horses to the iron gates, and the whole party entered the grass court and looked around. At that moment an old wizened face appeared at one of the small lozenges of a cottage window, and the next a chink of the door was opened, the mean and the same face gazed out. In time Mr. Sikes, with his riding whip in his hand, was pointing out to Soubise all the wonders of the place, telling him where the great hall used to stand, where the guest chambers were, and where the private apartments of the Lady of Langley. Never before in his life was he so eloquent. While he went on, the old man of perhaps 80 hobbled across the road and came close up to the side of Dr. Winthorne. Just at that moment Mr. Sikes pointed with his whip to a tower a little detached from the main building, and apparently of more ancient architecture, saying, "That was the wine and ale cellar, and I have heard people say that during the fire the casks burst with an explosion like so many cannon." "That is not true," said the old man, who had just come up, "for there had not been a thing or a body in that tower for 30 years before. Why, the stairs were half blown away, and Sir Richard would have pulled it down if it had not been for my lady, who liked the look of it." "Ah, is that you, old Grimes?" said Mr. Sikes. "Why, you look younger than ever." "I shall live to bury you yet," said the old Saxton. "Don't make me wait long, for I am tired enough of life, I am sure. Who is that you have got with you, Sikes?" "This is a French nobleman, the Prince de Soubise," replied the attorney. "As he cannot live in his own country on account of the troubles, he has come over to England. We have been talking about his buying this place. Indeed, it is almost a bargain. He will have all these ruins cleared away," he continued in a confidential tone, and somewhat dropping his voice, to prevent Dr. Winthorne from hearing too much. The old sexton's face had turned a little pale, but the next instant he said a little gruffly, "You can't sell him the place, Sikes." "No, but Sir Richard can," replied the lawyer. The old man grunted forth something which nobody heard distinctly, but which had some reference to Sir Richard, and to not paying a pension, and giving no orders. Sikes kept his eye fixed upon him steadily, and though he saw an uneasy look come upon the old man's face, which was turned at that moment toward the ruined tower, and looking round, the attorney saw that the servants, having left the horses at the gate, were sporting about the courtyard, and that Piero had mounted upon a pile of stones which had fallen from the tall wall above. "What were you saying, Grimes?" asked Mr. Sikes. "That Sir Richard had not paid your pension? That is strange. The agent has plenty of money in his hands, for he has got all the rents of Langley, and Sir Richard has not drawn a farthing." "Ay, but he says he has no orders," said Grimes, with a hasty and uneasy manner. "But what I am saying now is, that man will break his neck if he goes up there. I tell you he will." I put my hip out once doing just the same thing." "Ha!" exclaimed Sikes. "I thought that was at the fire, Grimes. But what you say is very true. He will break his neck. Call him down, sir, call him down. He is your servant." The last words were addressed to Edward, who instantly called to Piero to come down, which the good man unwillingly did, for he had imbibed just a sufficient quantity of liquor to make him full of sport without shaking his nerves. Now it is to be hoped that the reader read and pondered well the description given of that old tower in the 7th chapter of this eventful history, but as there are some readers, and a great number of them, who will skip certain passages, which they in their superciliousness think of little importance, I may as well recall the words of Edward Langdale while he was narrating the scenes of his early life to Clement Tournon and Lucette. The whole of the house was burned, he said, on that occasion, and the greater part of the walls fell in, with the exception of those of the ivy tower, which were very ancient and much thicker than the rest. Even there the woodwork was all consumed, and the staircase fell, except where a few of the stone steps, about half-way up, clung to the masonry. Since Edward had seen the place, or marked it with any particular attention, some changes had come over that tower, though they were not very apparent. We shall be compelled to notice them more in a moment or two. Suffice it for the present to say that those stone steps which Edward had mentioned were still sticking out about half-way up the tower, and that, somehow or another, Piero had contrived nearly to reach them. However, Mr. Sikes took no notice of the careful forethought of an old sexton for a foreign servant's life, though he thought his benevolence strange, but went on round the old building, the piles of rubbish, and the blackberry bushes which encumbered them, speaking a word or two every now and then to Dr. Winthorne, and keeping Mr. Grimes in pretty constant conversation. There is a game which young people play at, called, I think, hide and seek, and Mr. Sikes was determined to have a game with the old sexton. The seeker, when he approaches the object of his search, is told that he is hot. When he goes far from it, that he is cold. Now, in the neighbourhood of most parts of the old building, Grimes's face said, as plainly as possible, cold, cold as ice, that when Mr. Sikes brought him near to the old ivy tower again, there was a tremulous motion of the hanging underlip, an anxious twinkle of the eye, and a fidgety motion of the hands, which said, as plainly as possible, warm, warm, very hot. This was the more apparent when the party came in face of that part of the tower where about a third of the wall, rent from top to bottom by the great heat, had fallen and strewn the ground with ruins. Mr. Sikes did not look up at the tower at all. His eyes were fixed upon the face of Mr. Grimes, and he was reading it as a book. Dr. Winthorne was reading it too. Edward Langdale and the Prince de Soubise were talking together in French, but their eyes were about them all the time. Suddenly Edward exclaimed in English, "Why, Piero could have gone up very easily. There is a stone taken out of the wall every 2 or 3 feet, and between them somebody has made steps by jamming in large blocks of wood with smaller stones. Besides, the tough old stems of ivy would take anyone up who has hands to hold by. Piero, Piero." "No, no," cried Dr. Winthorne. "Send for a ladder from the church. My man shall go." "Doctor, doctor," said Mr. Grimes, with a face as pale as death, "I want to speak to your reverence." "Well, speak out," cried the bluff parson, but the old man drew him a little aside and said, "If they will give me £100 sterling, I will tell them something." "Not a penny, you old sinner," said Mr. Winthorne. "Go down for the ladder to the church, William. Get some men and bring it up, and be quick. Oh, doctor, I am an old man, and had suffered very much for the last 15 years. What is that he is saying? What is that he is saying?" said Sikes. "I have a notion you are very like the boy who went up the apple tree to steal his neighbour's fruit. The branch broke, and he cracked his leg, and ever after he used to say that it had pleased God to afflict him." At that moment a loud shout was heard from the tower above, and Piero, who had run up like a squirrel, put out his head, shouting, "A pie's nest! A pie's nest! Here are all manner of things." "Well, stay there and guard them," cried Dr. Winthorne. "They're all mine!" cried the old man Grimes, wringing his hands and speaking with the air and tone of a disappointed demon. "Well, I will not speak a word. I have done nothing. What business have you to take my things? I shall go home. If there is law in England, I will have it. and he was turning away toward the gates when Mr. Sikes took him by the arm, saying, "John Grimes, I apprehend you for robbery on the night of the fire at Langley. Master Ned, tell that servant not to let him depart. I will be responsible. I know my man, and have had my eye upon him for many years. The old fool could not keep his tongue from babbling, and boasted what he could do if he liked." A few minutes passed in almost perfect silence, till the church ladder was brought and reared against the tower, and then all the younger men ran up. Dr. Winthorne and Mr. Sikes kept guard over the prisoner, having no great confidence in their own agility, not being much accustomed to mount ladders, and for a moment or two Mr. Grimes, now evidently panic-struck, continued to whisper eagerly to Dr. Winthorne, while Mr. Sikes's eyes were turned with impatience toward the tower. "I can promise you nothing," answered the clergyman bluffly. "It is no great matter to them what you confess or what you don't, but perhaps if you do tell the whole truth, Ned Langdale, in consideration of your great age, may spare you. It is a horrible thing to see a man hanged at 80. At that moment the servants began to come down, bringing between them a chest of no very great size, but bound with brass and somewhat ornamented, though its colour and appearance showed it to have been a good deal scorched with fire. Though its weight did not seem great, the men carried it with much care, the occasion of which became evident when they reached the ground, for the top had been rudely forced open, and they were afraid of its falling back and the contents tumbling out. A number of other objects were subsequently brought down: a chalice, evidently the property of some church, a silver waiter, a clergyman's cassock, a number of silver spoons bearing the arms of the family of Langdale, and a whole mass of miscellaneous articles, some valuable, some perfectly worthless. But Mr. Sikes put his foot firmly upon the chest after it was laid upon the ground, saying, "Take notice, doctor, that I do not open this till there are plenty of witnesses." The moment, however, that the Prince de Soubise and Edward had descended, he called upon them to remark what the chest contained, and proceeded to the examination. It is not my intention to give a descriptive catalogue of old papers, but after turning over many documents of no great importance, a parchment was found and opened, and the Prince de Soubise instantly put his finger on the lowest part of the 5th sheet, saying, "There stands my name." "Well," said Dr. Winthorne, "I can easily conceive this old man stealing the sacrament cup and the silver spoons. I remember the robbery of the church quite well. Those he could melt down, and he was a great fool for not doing it. But why he should take Brother Winston's gown, which he could never dare to wear, and why he should steal this box of papers, which he could make no use of, I cannot imagine. It is impossible for any writer of history to discover and describe the real motives of one half the actions he relates, and what it was that moved old Grimes the sexton at that moment, I cannot at all pretend to say, but he certainly mumbled in low and tremulous accents, and with some tears, "I thought it was my lady's jewel case." The scene which then took place is not worthy of description. Let the reader imagine the congratulations that were poured upon Edward Langdale, how all his friends shook hands with him heartily, how Piero, from his knowledge of English, understood the whole, almost danced with joy, and how the servant of the Prince de Soubise, seeing all the rest do it, shook hands with him too, and wished Monsieur a good morning, being the two principal words he possessed. A cart was procured, and also a constable, under whose charge, escorted by Dr. Winthorne's servant, Mr. Grimes and the contents of his magpie's nest, with the exception of the all-important settlement, which Mr. Sikes would not part with, were carried over to Applethorpe that night. Dr. Winthorne and his party had preceded them by nearly an hour, and very important business occupied the remainder of the day till it was time to retire to rest. On that business we need not dwell at present, but in order not to be obliged to turn back to a character which, however important, has appeared but briefly, let me say that that very night Mr. Grimes, in the first terror of detection, made a full and frank confession of all he had done. He had been one of the first to enter the house on the night of the fire, and had met Lady Langdale carrying the case which contained her marriage settlement. He had instantly asked her after her boy, and dropping the case, she had flown to Edward's room to see if he had been rescued by his father. The sexton, concluding that the case contained her jewels, had seized upon it and carried it off. At first he had concealed it under some of the bushes, but had afterward carried it up to what was called the Ivy Tower, which, having been vacant and in ruins for some years, he imagined would never be searched. When asked why he had not carried it to his own cottage, he replied, because that was certain to be examined as soon as they discovered that anything was lost. He was never prosecuted for the thefts he had committed, but he died some 7 weeks after, perhaps as much from shame and disappointment as disease, and thus he never had the pleasure of burying Mr. Martin Sykes. End of chapter 47. Chapter 48 of Lord Montagu's Page by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 48. I can promise you nothing, my young friend, said the Prince de Soubise, about a fortnight after the period at which I concluded my last chapter, till I have consulted with my brother Rohan and some other members of my family. You English people view these matters differently from ourselves in France. A marriage is not only the uniting two persons who are attached to each other, but it is the linking of two families together. Of course, this nominal and merely formal marriage between you and my young cousin is altogether null and void, of no effect or consequence. I do not know, my lord the prince, replied Edward, in a tone of a good deal of irritation. I have been assured it is a perfectly valid marriage, and I must respectfully add, I shall attempt to prove it so. Pshaw! Said Soubise in a light tone. We had better not take up hostile positions toward each other, and turning on his heel, he left the room. The scene of this conversation was the rector's library at Applethorpe, for Dr. Winthorne had a headache and had retired to rest, and as soon as the prince was gone, Edward took forth some letters he had received that morning, and, approaching the table where the candles stood, he read them again with an eager look. No French post, to his knowledge, had come in, but the letters were evidently from France, and one, addressed to Clement Tournon, was sent open to him, whilst another, very short but in Lucette's own hand, tied and sealed, came to him direct. Both were of a date which surprised and alarmed the young Englishman. That from Clement Tournon dated only 2 days after he had lost Rochelle, that from Lucette fully 7 weeks previous. The letter of the good goldsmith which enclosed the other was somewhat long. It told Edward a great deal about Rochelle, and contained much matter that need not be recapitulated, but the point of greatest interest was his mention of Lucette. Probably, he said, she has told you in the enclosed all she has told to me, and therefore I need not repeat it. She calls upon us both for aid, and as far as a feeble old man can give it, she shall not want it. But, alas, my dear Edward, it is very wrongly that men attribute power to wealth. I have proved it, and know that there are times when heaps of gold will not buy a loaf of bread. However, if my last livre will help that dear girl, she shall have it. In the meantime, do you, young, active, enterprising as you are, follow her directions to the letter. You can do more than I can. I set out this night, but considering that you may want money for so long and expensive a journey, I have left such directions that all your drafts upon me will be paid to any reasonable amount. In a month I will be in Huntingdon, where I am assured by one I can depend upon that my presence is required for your benefit. Lucette's letter was but a note. Fly to me, my beloved husband, so it said. If you love your poor Lucette as she loves you, come to me without the delay of an hour. There are people here who want to take me away and carry me to France. They have no authority from Monsieur de Rohan, otherwise, as hard as he is, I should feel myself secure. But they have great power with the rulers of this republic, it seems. Madame de la Cour is an excellent woman, but weak and timid. She says that she dares not resist them, that she is but a poor exile herself, and that, when they are ready to go, she must yield me up to them. I would rather die, were it not that, when I think of you, hope still comes in to give me a ray of light, which all these sorrows and troubles cannot darken. Oh, come soon to your Lucette. Edward looked at the date again. There was no time to be lost, if he were not already too late, and at once he determined on his course. The 2 years during which he had promised not to seek Lucette were nearly at an end. The words of Monsieur de Soubise had given him no encouragement to wait for the consent of her family. The only course was to make her his own, irrevocably, then let them scoff at the marriage between them if they would. He would go to Richelieu, he thought. He would lay down before him the letters he had received. He would beseech the cardinal to free him for the few short weeks that remained from the promise he had made, and to speed him to Venice with the power which only he possessed. Once side by side with his dear little bride, he thought, it would not be in the power of worlds to tear them apart. The determined and impetuous spirit roused itself. Recent success had refreshed hope. He had found more money waiting for him than he expected, so that none of the small material obstacles which so frequently trip up eagerness were present, and he determined to set out that very night. Not more than half an hour was occupied in his preparations, and then he went to Dr. Winthor's room and knocked at the door. After the second knock, a somewhat testy voice told him to come in, and there he remained for a full hour in earnest conversation. Whatever took place, nothing Dr. Winthorne said induced him to alter his resolution, but about midnight he and Pierrot mounted in the courtyard and set out for London. Let us pass over all the little impediments of the road, the horseshoes and the blacksmiths, and the trouble about a pass from Dover to Calais, which, as the relations between France and England had become much more amicable, presented no great difficulties after all, and let us carry Edward at once to the gates of Paris, where the gay and glittering crowd was as dense and perhaps more brilliant in those days than it is in ours. The young man's brain felt almost confused at the numbers before his eyes and the whirling rapidity of everything around him. As he knew nothing of the town, he had to ask his way to an inn which had been recommended to him, and met with all the urbanity and real good humour which have always distinguished the Parisian population. The master of the auberge, for there were no hotels in Paris till the nobility who had hotels, broken in fortune and deprived of power, were forced to sell their dwellings to the affable receivers of all men, welcomed him, as he himself would have called it, with all distinction, and his reverence was greatly increased when the young stranger called for pen and ink and paper, and indited a note to the Cardinal Prime Minister, telling him of his arrival in Paris, and craving an audience as soon as possible on business of the utmost importance. He had the good faith to tell him that the business was of importance to himself, but that frankness was not thrown away upon the cardinal. He sealed the letter with the great seal of his arms, and begged the aubergist to send it immediately by a messenger who would, if possible, obtain an answer. The good man remarked that it was the hour of the cardinal's dinner, and that men said that his eminence was to set off on the following day upon a long journey. "The more reason he should have that letter as soon as possible," said Edward. "Pray let it go without delay, and if the man brings me back an answer, I will give him a gold crown." What took place at the cardinal's palace, a smaller building than the magnificent edifice he afterward erected, long known first as the Palais Cardinal and afterward as the Palais Royal, I do not know, but at the end of an hour and a half the man returned, and, with a happy grin, demanded his gold crown, handing Edward a sealed paper. The contents were as follows: "I am commanded by his eminence to inform Monsieur de Langdale that, though he cannot give him a formal audience, he will see him tonight at the theatre of the Hôtel de Bourgogne, when he will hear whatever he has to communicate. This letter presented at the door will be his introduction. Rossignol." Edward Langdale took care to obtain every information he could from the landlord in regard to the Parisian theatre, which was at that time just beginning to rise into some degree of importance. Some years before, the theatres of Paris were merely the resort of bad women and dissolute men, and the scene of very bad actors. But Richelieu, with that fine taste which was one of his remarkable characteristics, had not only seen that the stage might easily be refined, but had absolutely refined it. Excellent actors were engaged at both the great theatres of Paris. Authors, not alone of merit, but of real genius, pressed forward in a new career of literature, and the highest and purest ladies of the French court graced the theatre, perhaps as much to please and flatter the great minister as for any entertainment they received. At the hour which had been indicated by the landlord, Edward was at the door of the Hôtel de Bourgogne, and as he saw that everybody was paying for entrance, he did the same, and then exhibited the letter to the secretary Rossignol. The moment it was seen by the people at the door, the effect was magical. 2 men started forward, bowing to the ground, reproached the young stranger in somewhat stilted terms for not showing the note before he had to pay for admission, and begged to lead him to the cardinal, who they informed him had just entered. The arrangement of a theatre in those days was very different from that of modern times, but yet Richelieu had his little room, or box as we should call it now, at the Hôtel de Bourgogne, close to the stage, but not upon it. Into this room no one was admitted but those specially invited, and at the door stood 2 of his guards, who, however, gave instant ingress to Edward as soon as they saw the letter he carried in his hand. In the box were some 8 or 9 people, with the cardinal himself on the left-hand side, where he had a full view of the stage, but could hardly be seen from the body of the house. The play had not commenced, and he turned his head at the sound of the door as Edward entered. The moment he saw him, he beckoned him up to his side, before Edward had seen the other persons in the box, who, be it remarked, were all standing. Richelieu's first question was what had brought his young friend, as he was pleased to call him, to Paris before the stipulated time. Edward, in his usual brief style, explained all the circumstances, and without hesitation placed the 2 letters he had received in the minister's hands. Richelieu read them and smiled, saying, "So you are both still very much in love with each other. Well, I have done one good work at least in life pour l'amour de Dieu. Now, what do you intend to do, Monsieur Landale?" "To go post-haste to Venice, may it please your eminence," replied Edward, "and when I arrive there, as it will not want much more than 6 weeks of the time I promise you not to seek her as my wife, I intend to ask you to free me from that promise, let me claim her as my own, and trust to my good luck and your power to sustain me." The cardinal seemed half inclined to laugh. "Take her when you can get her," he said, with something more than a smile, "but you cannot get to Venice, my good boy, till the king opens the pass of Suza. Don't you know that the very impracticable Duke of Savoy holds all the passes closed, and thinks he can resist the power of France?" "By the Lord, I wish I had the power of France," said Edward. "I would soon make him open them." "Ha, ha," said Richelieu, with a significant nod of the head. "Did I not tell you that one day you would become ambitious? But the power of France is just as well as it is, and I think the king can open the passes as well as you could. He has gone there now, and I am going after him to witness his victory. But hush, they are going to begin the play. Mark it well, and tell me what you think of it." Almost as he spoke, the comedy commenced, and Edward withdrew from Richelieu's side into the little crowd behind. It was a piece of no great merit, one of the failures of the great Corneille, and, to say the truth, Edward's thoughts were deeply engaged with other things. While he was trying to attend, however, his hand was gently pressed by someone near, and, turning round, he beheld the diminutive figure of Marini, the Italian adventurer. There was something in the man that Edward could not altogether dislike, especially after the kindness he had shown him on 2 or 3 occasions, and he shook hands with him warmly. The little man stood on tiptoes and said in a whisper, "Good fortune to you. You and the cardinal will always have good fortune unless you quarrel. Look just opposite. Did you ever see so beautiful a creature?" Edward cast his eyes across the theatre, which was not very well lighted, and saw a group of ladies splendidly dressed and well deserving commendation. But there was only one who struck him particularly, seated somewhat behind, and with the profile alone displayed. There was something, however, so exquisitely beautiful in the line of the face and the whole turn of the head, that Edward moved a little on one side to see her more distinctly. There, however, the head-dress of another lady interposed, and he was disappointed. At that moment the first act ended, and Richelieu beckoned him to his side again. "What are you staring at there, young man? What would your Lucette say? I am afraid you are faithless." "Oh no, my lord," replied Edward. "That lady is very beautiful, but Lucette is more so, to my mind at least." "Do you think so?" said Richelieu. "I do not know which you were looking at, but one of them is my niece, the Duchesse d'Aiguillon. What do you think of the comedy?" "Not much," replied Edward, "but I really am no judge, my lord." "I think you are a good judge," said Richelieu, whose dislike to Corneille is well known. "Now I will tell you what you had better do. Go on with me to Susa. You can help to force the pass as a volunteer if you like, and then proceed to Venice should you feel disposed. You shall have Morini for a companion, and I will give you one of the king's foragers to see that you are not starved on the road." No proposal could be more agreeable to Edward Langdale, but there was one impediment, which he frankly told the cardinal. As always happens, he had miscalculated his expenses, and found that the money he had brought from England would hardly suffice till he arrived at Venice. "I can get more to-morrow, your eminence, I believe," he said, "for I have full authority to draw on my good friend Clement Tournon, whose credit is good in Paris, but that will take time, and your eminence, I presume, sets out early." "Not very early," answered Richelieu, "but if you follow me the next day you will catch me on the road. You can ride fast, I know, for you nearly killed the poor Basques who were sent to ride after you when you left Nantes. Morini will help you to get the money. Don't you know he is an alchemist and can change anything into gold? But he will take you to my banker, who is the best alchemist after all. So Clement Tournon trusts you, does he? He is the first goldsmith of the kind, I fancy." "I can well afford to pay him whatever he lends me now, my lord," replied Edward, "for on one lucky day, which the Romans would have marked with a white stone, I recovered the deeds which secured to me my mother's large property, which deeds had been lost for several years." "What day was that?" asked Richelieu, in a somewhat eager tone. Edward told him, for he remembered it well, and the cardinal immediately called Morini to his side, and spoke to him for a moment or two in a low tone. "The very same day, your eminence sees," replied Morini with an air of triumph. "Such small coincidences may be necessary to confirm your belief. With me it is not so. The stars never lie, my lord cardinal." "If they speak at all, I suppose they do not," said Richelieu. "They have spoken very plainly in this case," replied the astrologer, "but the actors are going to begin again," and he was about to retire. "Never mind," said the cardinal, "stay here. I have orders to give you, and I want them obeyed to the letter." Edward knew that it was sometimes dangerous to overhear too much of the minister's conversation. He had heard of a man's finding his way into the Bastille merely because he had been very near his eminence while he was conversing with a friend, and he therefore prudently withdrew to a farther part of the box. While the second act went on, Richelieu continued to talk with Morini, in a low tone, it is true, but with an indifference not at all complimentary to the actors or the piece. To the last acts he was somewhat more attentive, but went away before the play was concluded, merely saying to Edward as he passed, "Go with this good signor, Monsieur Langdale, and follow his counsels. He has heard my opinion upon several matters, and until we meet again, you had better be guided by him, even in what may seem things of small consequence." Edward Langdale bowed, and the minister passed out, but Morini approached Edward's side, saying, "Let us go also, my young friend. There is no use of staying to see this stupid play." The young gentleman's eyes, however, were fixed upon the opposite side of the theatre, where the cardinal's niece and the ladies in her company were also preparing to take their departure. He had caught another glance of that beautiful face, though it was but for a moment, and now the figure, as she was moving away, showed lines as lovely as her profile. Taller than most of her companions, and yet not very tall, every movement seemed grace itself, and just as she was passing the door, she turned round and gave a quick glance at the cardinal's box, which certainly did not diminish the admiration of the young Englishman. "How very beautiful the Duchess of Aiguillon is," said Edward, turning to Morini. "Oh yes," replied the other, "she is perhaps the most beautiful woman in France, but take care of what you are about, for some people say the cardinal is in love with her himself, and he will bear no rival." "Oh, love," said Edward, "is out of the question. I look at her, Signor Morini, merely as I should look at a beautiful statue. I love one, as you know, fully as beautiful, and to me 1,000 times more dear than she could ever become." "Now you mention it," said Morini, "it strikes me there is some likeness between them." "There is," said Edward, "but Lucette is much younger, and not so tall. Now I will follow you, my good sir," and they went out of the theatre together. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49 of Lord Montagu's Page by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 49. Youth and fate are always at variance as to times and distances. Youth says 1 day, fate says 2. Youth says 50 miles, but fate almost always makes it 100. Edward had more difficulty in getting 1,000 crowns than he had expected, and he did not altogether think that Signor Morini aided him as much as he might have done. Richelieu, who had only made a very short stay in Paris, quitted the capital about midday, and Edward, as may be supposed, was all impatience to hurry after him. But Morini, on the contrary, was as cool and as composed as if he was making an astrological calculation, always remarking that he would overtake the minister long before he got to Susa. "He never travels very fast, you know," said the little Italian, "and, besides, he has got a whole party of the ladies of the court with him, who always make a march tedious. They went off at daylight this morning, but you may count upon them to make the journey at least 5 days longer than it ought to be." "Nevertheless," said Edward, "I wish to proceed as fast as possible, and the objections of these bankers seem to me to be ridiculous." "Oh no, they make no objections," said Morini. "They only want a little time to consider. They are not all in love. They do not all want to get to Venice. They do business in a business-like way, and have no idea of firing off large sums like cannon shot." However, the whole of that day passed without the money being procured, and the second day had seen the sun rise several hours, when at length Signor Morini thought fit to whisper 2 words in the ear of Monsieur Philippon, the banker, which, as if by magic, brought forth the 1,000 crowns about which there had been so much difficulty. Nevertheless, it was 3 o'clock in the evening before Edward Langdale could depart, and then, besides Signor Morini himself and the king's forager who had been promised, were 6 lackeys and pages, and a good deal of baggage, which did not promise to accelerate the journey. Once started, however, and with sufficient money in his pocket, Edward resolved to delay for no man, and to be at Susa as soon as the cardinal. He was somewhat mistaken in his calculation indeed, for Richelieu pursued his way, wherever he could, by water, and though the Prime Minister could always command boats, the young Englishman could not obtain the same accommodation in a country where the passage of troops and the court had rendered all means of progression scarce. In every other respect, the first part of Edward's journey was without accident, I might almost have said without incident, but it so happened that at Montagu, where the young gentleman arrived in the afternoon, a large party of ladies were setting out on horseback just at the moment he entered the little town. The number of servants with them, and a small body of the cardinal's guard, showed that they belonged to the court, which could not otherwise have been discovered by their faces, as each, according to the general custom of that day, wore a little black velvet mask called a loup, to guard her complexion when travelling. Signor Morini, however, either divined who each was by her figure, or else, with Italian carelessness, took his chance of mistakes, for he dashed at once amidst the party, talked first to one and then to another, and seemed very well received by all. Edward had ridden up by his side, but, as he knew nobody, he spoke to nobody, till one of the ladies observed, in a very sweet voice, "You do not seem so sociable as your companion, sir." "I could not presume," said Edward, "to address ladies whom I have never seen before, unless they gave me some encouragement to do so." "I do not know whether you have seen me," said the lady, "but I have seen you." "Pray, where?" asked Edward, "that I may give that wild bird, Fancy, some notion how to fly." "I saw you last with the cardinal at the Hôtel de Bourgogne," said the lady, with that sort of timid, trembling accents which are so attractive on young and beautiful lips, small drops of honey to young ears and hearts. "Last?" said Edward. "Had I ever the pleasure of seeing you before that night?" "I did not mean to say that," answered the lady, "but you imply that you did see me then." "I saw 2 or 3 very beautiful persons," said Edward, "but have no means of knowing which of those you are." "No, nor shall you have any," she replied, bowing her head gracefully, "neither today, nor tomorrow, nor the next day. But if you are very good and behave yourself very well, I may take off my loup some time between this and Michaelmas. But now tell me, where are you riding so fast? To get yourself killed at Susa?" "No," answered Edward, "such is certainly not my object, but I am going toward Venice, and wish to reach that city as soon as my horse can carry me." "Oh, that is a long way off," said the lady. "I think I must keep you near me. You shall be my cavalier along the road. I will find out some crime you have committed and put you to all sorts of penances." "But what if I have committed no crime?" asked the young gentleman. "Oh, but you have," she said. "You should have known me the moment you saw me. No mask should be sufficient to hide a lady from a gallant and courteous cavalier. You ought to be able to see my face through my loup, as if it were made of glass." Edward smiled, but made no reply, and he thought within himself, Lucette would not have spoken so to a mere stranger. What a difference there is between her pure, sweet simplicity and the free manners of these courtly ladies. "You do not answer," continued the lady. "I am afraid we do not ride fast enough for you. Now, what is it makes you so anxious to run forward to Venice? Now, I warrant it is some of the beautiful black eyes of the City of the Sea." "No, indeed it is not," replied Edward. "I never was in Venice in my life." "Well," she continued, "love of some kind at all events. Nothing but love could make a man in such a hurry. Now, tell me what kind of love it is." "Why, the most extraordinary love in the world," answered Edward. "The love of a man for his wife. A love they recognise little in France, not at all in Italy, and so dilute in Turkey that it is not worth having." "Very marvellous love indeed," replied the lady. "Yet I think if I were a man, and were married, I should love my wife better than you do." "I defy you," said Edward, laughing. "Now I will catechise you," returned the lady. "Do you think of her every day?" "Every hour, every moment," said Edward. "Do you make her your chief object in life? Pray for her, work for her?" "Everything else in life," said Edward, "is but valuable to me as it has reference to her. Ambition becomes splendid when I think it may elevate her. Money, which is but dross, seems to gain great worth if she is to share it." "And do you ever," continued the lady, laughing, "stare at pretty faces across a theatre and dream for a minute or two as to what might be your luck if you had not tied yourself to another?" "No," replied Edward boldly. "I sometimes may stare at pretty faces and think them very beautiful, when I think there is a fanciful resemblance to that which I think most beautiful of all." The lady was silent for a minute or two, but at length she answered, "Well, I think you are very rude. You must be an Englishman, you are so uncivil. You dare me so that I have a great mind to make you in love with me, just to punish you. Nay, do not shake your head. I could do it in 5 minutes. All men are as weak as water. At least, so I have always been told, and I could soon bring you to my feet if I chose to employ a few little simple arts upon you." "I doubt not your power, dear lady," replied Edward, "upon any heart not preoccupied like mine. But Helen of Troy, or her bright mistress, Venus herself, could have no effect upon one who loves as I do." "Well, this is too bad," said the lady. "We shall see. We have a long journey to take together, and if before it is over I do not make you tell me you love me, my name is not what it is." Just at this moment one of the young cavaliers rode up, with the gay and dashing air of his country and his class, and addressed the lady in some commonplace terms of gallant attention. In an instant she seemed turned into ice, answered a few words politely, but in so cold a tone that Edward could not but see at once the dangerous preference she seemed to show him. The young man appeared to feel it too, and after staying by her side for about 5 minutes, he directed his horse to another group, where his society seemed more welcome. The conversation was renewed between Edward and his fair companion as soon as the officer was gone, and did not much vary in character from the specimen already given. It was late, however, when the party arrived at Châtillon, and the ladies retired at once to the apartments which had been prepared for them. But at 8 o'clock on the following morning none of them had quitted their chambers, nor did Edward see any preparation among guards or attendants for pursuing the journey before a late hour. Calling Piero without much deliberation, the young Englishman ordered his horses to be saddled, and was in the act of mounting, when Marini, whom he had not yet seen that day, appeared at the door, exclaiming, "Hi! Where are you going?" "To Susa," replied Edward, springing on his horse's back; and without waiting to hear any remonstrances from the little Italian, he rode off as fast as he could go. We will not pursue him on his journey, nor even dwell upon the forcing of the pass at Suza. Suffice it to say that Edward arrived just in time to volunteer the night before the attack. Richelieu he did not see, although he heard he was in the camp. But one of the first persons he met with was the young officer who had gone down with him to the outposts before Rochelle, and who now gaily marched up with him against the entrenchments at Suza. It is well known how they were taken at the first rush, with no great resistance on the part of the troops of Savoy. But Edward and his companion both received slight pike wounds, one in the arm and the other in the shoulder, sufficient to show that they had been in the heat of the battle, but not severe enough to obtain much commiseration. The king, as was usual with him, retired to his quarters as soon as the pass was carried, without inquiring the amount of his loss, or taking any notice of the wounded. Not so Richelieu, for as soon as the particulars could be ascertained, he caused a list of all who had suffered much or little to be laid before him. On the following morning, somewhat to his surprise, Edward received a summons to attend the cardinal, and when he presented himself, met with a somewhat sharp rebuke for having left Marini and his party. "They tell me you are wounded," said Richelieu. "It serves you very right, for having disobeyed my commands." "It is but a scratch, sir," said Edward. "A rusty nail in an old door would inflict a worse, and I was anxious to show that in all cases, except my own country, I am really desirous of serving your eminence." "That is all very well," replied the cardinal, "but I like to be obeyed. You could not tell my views or purposes in the directions which I gave, but as it is done, it cannot be helped. And now I suppose you are longing to go on to Venice." "Most anxiously," replied Edward, "if I understand your eminence rightly, that you free me from the promise I made to you some 2 years ago, and authorise me to claim my bride wherever I may find her." "That is soon settled," said Richelieu, and taking up a pen, he wrote, "Lucette Marie de Mirepoix du Valais is the wife of Edward Langdale of Buckley, and these are to summon and require all persons who have or have had any control or custody of the said Lucette, to give her up to the said Edward Langdale, her husband, and, in the king's name, to warn all persons to refrain from opposing the rights of the said Edward Langdale in regard to the said Lucette de Mirepoix, under pretence of relationship, guardianship, or any other cause whatever." He signed it with his name and gave it to Edward, saying, "Get it sealed, and then away to Venice as soon as you please. Peace will be signed in 3 days, if I am not mistaken, and not only peace with Savoy, young gentleman, but with England also. Hard-headed England! In the meantime you shall pass freely. My safe conduct, which of course you have with you, is as good now, I imagine, in Italy as in France. Only one thing more. Let it be understood that you return and join me as soon as you have fulfilled your mission, and bring your bride with you, if you find her." He paused with a smile of much good humour, and then added, "When you come back I may have a little negotiation for you, for the first steps to the surrender of Rochelle I owe to you." The political events which followed are well known. The peace of Suza with Savoy and England, the raising of the siege of Casale, and the relinquishment of Mantua to the house of Nevers, succeeded with the utmost rapidity, and the Cardinal de Richelieu saw everything that his mind conceived or his hand touched perfectly successful. In the meantime, Edward Langdale hastened over the Alps, crossed the whole breadth of Italy, and, taking boat at Mestre, landed in Venice. But he was not so successful as the great man he had just left. Richelieu's safe conduct obtained for him instant access to all the authorities of the Republic, and, with more frankness than they usually displayed, they informed him at once that the young lady he sought was no longer in the city. She had been claimed, they said, some months before, by authority which their laws prevented them from opposing, and had been carried, they believed, into Savoy. Edward then asked for Madame de la Cour, but he found that she also had left Venice, and had gone, they believed, to Paris. The only person, they said, who knew anything of Mademoiselle de Mirepoix was an old merchant who had arrived some days before, and was living at a goldsmith's on the Slavonian quay. Edward hurried there, and, as he expected, found old Clement Tournon, but the worthy syndic could give him no information, and was in almost as much distress about his Lucette as Edward himself. "Depend upon it," he said, "that horrid Madame de Chevreuse has got possession of the dear girl at last, and our only resource will be an appeal to the cardinal. He has eyes everywhere, and will both know where to find her and how to recover her." No time was lost. The old man and Edward set off together, directing their course by Turin and Suza. But again they were disappointed. The king, who in time of war forgot all his slothful inactivity and showed the fire and eagerness of his father, had by this time turned upon the Cevennes, the last refuge of the Protestants in France, and Richelieu had followed, or rather accompanied him. With a delay of one day at Chambéry to rest the old man, Edward pushed on after the cardinal toward Nîmes, hearing nothing as he went but tales of Louis's exploits. The army of the Duke de Rohan, which had opposed successfully several of the best generals in France, had seemed paralysed by the fierce energy of the king. Town after town had fallen, and Montauban itself, the people said, could not hold out 3 days. Such was the last intelligence which Edward received just after his entrance into Nairn, but, at the same time, came the news, far more satisfactory to him, that Richelieu himself was at Alais, but a few miles distant. No horses were to be procured, his own were tired, nearly to floundering, and poor Clement Tournon, in his eagerness to keep up with his young companion, had greatly overtasked his strength. Nothing remained but to pass the night at Nairn, a mere village, where almost every house was occupied by some of the followers of the court. But though the accommodation was as poor as it could be, yet Edward saw the next morning that Clement Tournon must still remain at Nairn. His bodily powers were not equal to carry him farther without long repose, and Edward set out for Alais alone, leaving Pierrot to attend upon the old man. The little town, when the young gentleman entered it, was all alive. Courtiers and soldiers were fluttering about in every direction, and the gay dresses, unspotted and fresh, showing that the court had been some days there, contrasted sadly with Edward's dusty garments and travel-soiled apparel. Nevertheless, he rode straight forward, through what is now called the Place de la Maréchale, to a house where the numerous groups, both on foot and horseback, before the door, led him to believe the cardinal's quarters were established. There he sprang to the ground under the arcade, and leaving his tired horse with the perfect certainty that he would not run away, he was pushing his way through the little crowd around, noticed very little by anybody, when the voice of his young companion in the attack at Suza met his ear, exclaiming, "Ah, Monsieur de Longuedale, have you heard Montauban has been taken? But do not let me stop you, for his eminence was asking for you yesterday." "As you are of his household," said Edward, "will you have the kindness to tell his eminence that I am here? For I know none of these people, they do not know me, and I suspect I am not a very courtier-like figure to seek an audience of the Prime Minister." "I will do it directly," said the young officer. "He is very busy, but I know he wishes to see you, so follow me up." Edward mounted the stairs close after his companion, and entering a chamber to which there was no anteroom, as he had expected, found himself immediately in the presence of Richelieu, who was seated at a table near the window, while 2 secretaries were writing at his right hand. The room was half full of people, some of whom were waiting silently as if for audience, while others were conversing in low voices, and one middle-aged man was speaking to the cardinal, with a paper in his hand, as if making a report. Richelieu raised his eyes as Edward entered, but took no notice, and continued to listen attentively to the gentleman who was speaking. As soon as he was done, the cardinal said, "Well, be it so, see that it is done," and wrote a few words on a sheet of paper. Another and another succeeded, spoke a few words to the minister, and received their answer. And then Richelieu, rising, said aloud, "No more audiences this morning." The young Englishman was about to retire with the rest, who were slowly going out, but the cardinal added the next moment, "Monsieur Longuedale, I wish to speak to you." Thus saying, he passed into a room beyond, and Edward followed, leaving none but the secretaries in that which they had just quitted. It was a bedchamber they now entered, for, when campaigning, prime ministers as well as others must put up with such accommodation as they can get, and Richelieu neither seated himself nor asked his companion to be seated. "You have come at an important moment," said the cardinal abruptly. "I almost feared you would not be here in time. Are you willing to undertake a mission for me to Monsieur le Duc de Rohan, some 40 miles hence? Certainly, your eminence, replied Edward, but I must make 3 conditions, though, to you. They are very slight ones. Ha! said Richelieu, his brow somewhat darkening. I am not accustomed to conditions, but let me hear what they are. You are an original, like most of your countrymen. Perhaps I shall be able to grant them. Simply these 3, my lord cardinal. That while I am gone you shall cause search to be made for my young wife, who is not in Venice, and has been brought to France, and is beyond doubt, I think, in the hands of Madame de Chevreuse. Granted, said Richelieu. The next, that you shall send over a physician to good old Clement Tournon, whom I have left ill at Nairn. Ah, said Richelieu, is he at Nairn? That is most lucky. That man Marini said truly. Fortune goes with you. He may help me to raise the money, so that there may be no delay. For you must know, Master Langdale, that even kings and prime ministers, when they carry on expensive wars, sometimes come to the end of their finances at the very moment when large sums are most necessary. Clement Tournon, he is connected with all the goldsmiths of Nîmes, is he not? I heard him say on the journey that he had a number of friends there, and also in Avignon, replied Edward. It will do, said Richelieu. Your second condition is granted. What is the third? That your eminence lends me a fresh horse, for my own is knocked up. I could wish also that I had some servant with me, someone who knows the way. The horse you shall have, said Richelieu. But as for the servant, he continued thoughtfully, I think you must go alone. I do not wish to send any Frenchman to that camp. Nay, more, nobody must know where you are going. Look at this map. This is the road, and he pointed with his finger to a map of the Cevennes. First you go there, to Saint-Martin, then on to Madieu. There you must inquire where the Duke is encamped. I think it is somewhere near Saint-Andéal, but you will soon learn. He ceased and fell into a fit of thought, and after waiting 2 or 3 minutes, Edward inquired, And what am I to say to him, or will your eminence write? No, I will negotiate no more, answered Richelieu. Say to him I have received his message, and I answer 100,000 crowns in money in 4 days on the conditions expressed before, and I wish his answer, yes or no, before midday tomorrow. 1 horse will not carry me there and back, if it be 40 miles, in that time over those mountains, said Edward. Pshaw! Kill the horse and buy another, exclaimed Richelieu. It is worth 10 horses for me to have the news tomorrow. Stay, you must have some credence. Thus saying, he went into the other room again, was absent a few minutes, and returned with a small packet and a sheet of paper. Both were addressed to the Duc de Rohan, and after the latter was written, Hear and believe the bearer, Edward Langdale, to you already known, and then followed the great scrawl of Richelieu. The packet was sealed, but as the cardinal gave it to his young friend, he said, That contains the terms which he must sign and return by your hand. Go down and get yourself some breakfast in the eating hall while the horse is getting ready. You will find good wine there, but remember, silence. Edward went down and soon procured refreshment, but ere he had eaten more than a few mouthfuls or drank more than 1 draught of wine, one of the secretaries whom he had seen above came in with a very reverential bow, saying, His eminence desires me to ask if Monsieur de Langdale requires any money for his journey. No, replied Edward, I have enough. The horse was announced as ready the moment after, and Edward, springing on his back, set out before the secretary lost sight of him. End of chapter 49. Chapter 50 of Lord Montagu's Page by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 50. The ride was long and hot, for it was just the middle of the month of June, and though the scenery is perhaps without its parallel in the whole world, combining more beauties and more varieties of beauty than ever I saw anywhere else, though every now and then the road was shaded with trees attaining a height and breadth which would shame the forest giants, yet toward evening Edward was forced to acknowledge to himself that he was very much exhausted. The horse which bore him was excellent, strong, willing, but not easy in its gait, and it also, ere they reached Saint-Andéal, showed the effects of the heat, proceeding though it had not had the journey from Nairn to Alais. At Saint-Autral He had but little difficulty in extracting from the townspeople an account of the position of the Duke de Rohan's camp, and Edward rode on under the shade of the mountains somewhat more slowly, calculating that he would have time both to take some rest and return to Alais before noon on the following day. It was dark when he arrived, and all that he could discover of the position of the camp was that it was very strong, while a number of mountain gorges radiating from a centre offered the means of retreat in almost any direction. After some difficulties and delays at the outposts, he gave up his horse to one of the soldiers, who regarded him with a somewhat gloomy look, and was led to a little rudely constructed hut, where a sentry kept guard before the door. He found the Duke de Rohan perfectly alone, and, advancing to meet him, he was received in a much more courteous and friendly manner than at their last interview. "Monsieur Langdale," said the Duke, holding out his hand, "I am glad to see you. Pray be seated. I can only offer you a stool in this place, for we are obliged to fare hardly here. What brings you now, I know not, but I am glad of an opportunity of apologising for some rudeness and heat which I displayed at our last meeting. By your bearing the cardinal's safe conduct, I presume you come from him. What have you to say?" "First, let me hand you this," said Edward, giving him the letter of credence, over which the Duke ran his eye hastily. "And next," said Edward, "that, in answer to your message, his Eminence says 100,000 crowns to be paid in 4 days in money." "Is that all he said?" said de Rohan. "Are you to act as negotiator in this business, sir?" "Not in the least," replied Edward. "I merely bear you a message, and am perfectly ignorant of the whole circumstances, even of the contents of this package, though I have been told that it contains the conditions, which, if you assent to them, you will sign, and enable me to return them to the cardinal by noon tomorrow." The Duke took the packet, broke open the seal, and looked at the writing, which was very brief, consisting only of 3 paragraphs. There was a second paper, however, apparently briefer still. As he read, de Rohan knit his brows and bit his lip. "Am I to understand that you know nothing of these papers?" he asked. "Nothing whatever," replied Edward; and the Duke, rising from his stool, walked up and down the hut for some minutes in deep thought. "It must be done," he said at length. "There is no use taking counsel in the matter, for it is what they all wish, and thus ends the Protestant cause in France. Monsieur Langdale, the only part of these papers which is personal to myself is that," and he laid the second enclosure before the young Englishman. "Why the cardinal has made this a condition all along, I cannot conceive, unless it be a point of pride with him." Edward read the paper and perceived these words: "I do hereby solemnly consent to and affirm the marriage of my cousin Lucette Marie de Mirepoix du Valais with Edward Langdale of Buckley, in the county of Huntingdon, England, as solemnized at Nantes on the 3rd of July in the year of grace 1627. "I do assure you, my lord," said Edward, "this is none of my doing, and sooner than be any impediment to a peace so necessary to the poor Protestants of France, I say, tear it. I will win Lucette by other means." "No," said the Duke, "I will sign it. I will sign all; and when a Rohan pledges his word, the cardinal may be assured that it will be kept." He took a little inkhorn from a neighbouring table and signed the 2 papers. Then, shaking Edward by the hand again, he said, "Give you joy, cousin, but you look ill and tired." "I have ridden some 60 miles," said Edward, "with hardly any food and no rest." The Duke heard his reply with a rueful smile, but called a man from without, telling him to bring the best he had for a young gentleman's supper. The best was merely a bone of ham and some brown bread, but there was added a flagon of very good wine. "I require a little rest more than anything," said Edward, "and I would fain, my lord, lie down to sleep for a few minutes, if your people will take care of my horse, and wake me at 4 o'clock, when they change the sentries." "That shall be done," said de Rohan. "No chance of sleep for me to-night, after signing these papers. Here, you can sleep on my bed. It is as good as any in the camp, I suppose;" and opening a door in the boarded partition, he pointed to a great pile of rosemary and wild mountain herbs, saying, "It is little better than the ground, but fatigue gives balm to sleep." Edward's eyes were closed in a moment, and he knew nothing more till the Duke himself called him at 4. "Your horse is at the door," he said. "There are the papers. I hope his Eminence will be punctual in the payment, for I cannot turn 10,000 men loose amongst the mountains with no money in their pockets." Let the man who has brought the horse walk by your side and give the passwords." Edward rode away well pleased with his success, and about 11:30 reached the small town of Alais. There he was informed that the cardinal had not returned from Nairn, but that Monsieur Rossignol would see him; and on being admitted to the well-known secretary, an order to deliver the papers which he brought, signed by Richelieu, was given him. Edward obeyed, and good Monsieur Rossignol, a man of great talent, though originally a peasant, said, in a significant tone, "It will be better for monsieur to ride out to the castle at Bourillon, near Nairn, where he will find the cardinal." "My good sir, I am tired to death, and my horse can hardly move a leg. You forget what these mountain roads are like." "You can rest below for 3 or 4 hours," said the secretary. "Get some refreshment, by which time your own horse will have had rest sufficient, and then ride to Bourillon in the cool of the evening. It will be better. His Eminence desired it." The thought that perhaps Richelieu might have obtained, through his many-eyed communications, some news of Lucette, gave Edward fresh spirit; but still he followed the secretary's advice, for, after having ridden so hard for many days, some more repose was absolutely needful. Toward 4 o'clock, however, he set out towards Nairn, having ascertained that the château to which he was directed lay on the right of the road some 2 or 3 miles before he reached the village, and all that need be said of his journey is that the road, as every one knows, is beautiful, and that his thoughts were like all young men's thoughts, a little wild and chaotic perhaps, but with Lucette prominent above all. Some 2 miles before the castle appeared in sight, however, he was met by a large cavalcade of gentlemen, ladies, guards, and pack-mules, with Richelieu at its head, going back apparently to Alais. The cardinal drew up his horse, saying, "I have heard of you, my young friend. Rossignol has sent me a messenger. Our good friend the syndic is well and gone to Nîmes, but will be back in 2 days. Go on to the château, where I have ordered everything to be prepared for you. There rest in peace for the night. You will find nobody there to plague you, unless it be a few women, who, if they are wise, will let you alone." The cardinal moved on as he spoke, and Edward was fain to pursue his way to Bourillon. He found some servants on the drawbridge, loitering about in the fine summer sunset, but as soon as his name was given, the omnipotent commands of the cardinal made them all activity and attention. His horse was taken to the stable by one man, another ushered him into a handsome room communicating with a bedroom beyond, and a third ran to bring the supper which he said his Eminence had ordered for him. All around had a very comfortable aspect, and Edward thought, as he threw himself into a chair, a man with a wife whom he loved, and some little ones to cheer him, might pass his life very happily even here. The supper was soon brought, and was evidently the handiwork of some courtly cook. The wine was delicate and good, and Edward, according to the English fashion of all times, chose to take the moderate portion he did take after his meal. Telling the man who waited on him to leave him, he was about to pass the evening quietly, when, soon after the servant had quitted the room, the door was opened and someone looked in. One glance at the figure showed Edward that it was the lady with whom he had ridden some way from Montagu, and, to say the truth, the young Englishman would willingly have been spared her company. She still wore the black velvet loup over her face, which Edward thought was somewhat too coquettish, considering that it was now dark and the candles lighted. But, of course, he found himself bound to be polite, though he was determined to be as cold as ice. Yet there was something timid and hesitating in her manner that surprised him. As she came forward, he could see that she trembled, and rising, he placed a chair before her, saying, "To what am I indebted for this honour?" "I have come to pass the evening with you," she said in a low voice. "I cannot let you be here all alone." Edward did not well know what to reply, and he answered at random, "Let me beseech you, at all events, madam, to lay aside your mask now. Your complexion runs no risk here." "No," said the lady, shaking her head, "not till you tell me you love me and will marry me." "Are you not married already?" exclaimed Edward. "Yes," she answered, "I am, but that makes no difference. Do you love me?" "I have told you, dear lady," said Edward, in as calm a tone as he could assume, "that it is impossible. If you are the lady whom I saw at the Hôtel de Bourgogne, doubtless I could have loved you if my whole heart and soul had not been given to another, for I have seldom seen anybody more lovely." "But who is this you love so well?" said the lady. "Give me her name, her full name." "Lucette Marie de Millepois du Valais," said Edward impatiently. The mask was off in a moment. "Am I so changed, Edward?" said Lucette, throwing her arm round his neck. "I know I am taller, much taller, but I did not think you would ever forget me." "Forget you? Oh, no, no, Lucette," cried Edward, circling her in his arms, and covering her with kisses. "Have I ever forgotten you? Have I ever ceased to think of you? But I saw you but for a moment across the dull and misty air of a theatre, and you are changed, more charming, more beautiful than ever. But even Lucette unknown could not rob Lucette long known of the love that has been hers always. When for a moment I saw your face, I did not hear your voice, and when I heard your voice, I did not see your face. But now I see all these loved features distinctly, and wonder how I could be deceived." "We shall both change still more, Edward," she said, almost sadly. "And will you love me still?" "Better, still better," said Edward, clasping her to his heart. "If, Lucette, I loved you still after long absence, when you yourself tried to make me love another, do you suppose that affection will wane when the change comes over us together, and you yourself engage me to love you still? Oh yes, Lucette, I will not deny it, you are more beautiful than you used to be, but it was my young Lucette I loved, and how could I love any other?" "Well, I own that it was wrong," said Lucette, "to play with you and tease you as I did, but it was not to try you, for I was sure I knew your heart right well. It was the cardinal's command, however, and I feared to disobey him. He brought us all from Paris, some for one reason, some for another. One that she might not intrigue against him at the court of the Queen Mother, another to remove her from poor Anne of Austria, others for the amusement of the king and court, and perhaps to assist him in his own views. Why he brought me I know not, perhaps to tease you on the road. No, no, I do him injustice. I sincerely believe it was to unite us in the end. But do you forgive me, Edward? Do you forgive me for acting a part that is not in my nature? 100 times the mask was nearly taken from my face. My joy to find that you loved me still, and that you were faithful to your poor Lucette, passed all bounds, and made me almost faint with happiness. It is nearly 18 months since I saw you at Aix, and since then how much I have suffered, and I have heard that you have suffered too, that you have been apprehended and kept in prison, wounded again." "Oh, that is nothing," answered Edward. "All has been followed by joy and success. I never valued wealth, Lucette, till I met with you, but now I have beyond doubt recovered one half of my patrimonial property, all that belongs to me, but enough, and more than enough, to secure my Lucette against all those grinding cares and petty annoyances which, though less sharp than the fierce blows of misfortune, are more wearing to the spirit and the heart. But tell me, my Lucette, how came you here? I had feared, from what they said at Venice, that you had fallen into the hands of Madame de Chevreuse." "Oh no," she answered, "that was a mistake. The council notified Madame de la Cour that I was demanded by those who had a right to demand me in France, but with their usual secrecy gave no further information. At first I resolved to fly, but whither could I go? To Madame de Rohan I could not apply, for her life in Venice has been one of great scandal and disgrace. Madame de la Cour could not or would not help me, but in the end I found that it was the ambassador from France who claimed me, and when assured that I was to be under the guardianship of the cardinal himself, I went joyfully. He forbade me to write to you, saying you promised soon to rejoin him, and on the night I saw you at the theatre he told me to look at his loge, but to take no notice whatever I might see. The only thing I now fear is the opposition of my high relations. The Duke de Rohan is the head of the house, and though he was kind to me, very kind, while I was with him, I know him to be the proudest man on earth, and as obdurate in his determinations as a rock." "You are my wife," said Edward, pressing her to his heart, "my wife by every tie, human and divine. Soubise may oppose, Madame de Chevreuse may oppose, but their opposition is nothing. Look here what authority the cardinal gave me when I was setting out for Venice." Lucette looked at the paper which he gave her. "It was unkind of him to let you go," she said, "when he knew I was within 2 days' journey of Suza, but that was to punish you for leaving that little Morini on the road." "Do you know why I left him?" said Edward, kissing her rosy lips. It was because a very beautiful lady said she would make me love her before our journey was ended, and I was resolved to love nobody but Lucette. No, my Lucette, our journey together has never ended, and through life must never end. You are mine, as I have said, by every tie. The Duke de Rohan, the only one who had any real authority, I saw last night. His opposition was entirely withdrawn, and his formal approval of our marriage at Nantes was given in writing. Lucette was silent for a moment or two, and turned a little pale, and Edward asked in a low tone, "What ladies are there here in the castle?" "None," said Lucette, "except my maid. We are all alone." "Now I understand. I think I see why the cardinal took everyone else away and insisted on my staying." "Assuredly," replied Edward, "because you are my wife, Lucette, and he did not wish that we should be separated any more." Her face was now as rosy as the dawn, and her breath came thick with agitation. "You are mine, Lucette, are you not mine?" said Edward. "My own, my wife, my beloved." "Oh, yes, yes," sobbed Lucette, casting herself upon his bosom. "My husband, my own dear husband." And they parted no more. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51 of Lord Montagu's Page by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 51. The famous Peace of Alais, which terminated during the reign of Louis XIII. The struggles of the Protestants of France for a distinct organisation, and left them nothing but an insecure toleration, was concluded on the 27th of June 1629, a few days after the reunion of Edward and Lucette. None can doubt that Richelieu was politically right in asserting and enforcing the sovereign authority over a body of men who had made religious differences a pretext for rebellion and a continual source of exaction and menace, nor can one accuse him of having violated his word in any degree to the Huguenots. They were suffered to follow the forms of their religion in peace. Their peculiar tenets formed no obstacle to their admission into the highest offices of France, and the Duke de Rohan himself was employed in high and delicate negotiations, and ultimately fell in the military service of the monarch against whom he had so often fought. A few days after the period to which we have carried our story in the last chapter, the 100,000 crowns in gold which were necessary for him, as well to provide for his troops as to repair his own shattered fortunes, were paid to the Duke according to Richelieu's promise, and the Protestant army was immediately disbanded, glad to escape from the inevitable ruin and disaster which hung over their heads. The peace concluded at Suza restored those friendly relations with England which had so long been broken off. Spain and Savoy were, at least for the time, cowed by the power of France, and all men, both friends and enemies, saw in the well-directed operations of the French armies and the success of French diplomacy the great military and political genius of Armand Duplessis. In the meantime, the cardinal kindly left Edward and Lucette to the enjoyment of each other's society, and it was not till some 6 or 7 days after the union which he himself had aided so much to bring about, that he visited them at the castle of Burieux. Great success, if in the end it makes men haughty and overbearing, seems at first to soften and expand the heart, and Richelieu, at the culminating point of his fortunes, sat down and conversed with the two young people as their friend. He amused himself somewhat with their love, and expressed, and probably felt, some gratification at their happiness. "Monsieur Landais," he said, "a foolish prediction has been made to me, that as you and I were born on the same hour of the same day of the same month, though a number of years apart, how many I do not remember, my fate and yours should run together, and though, of course, I put no faith in it, that prophecy has yet proved remarkably true. I am, therefore, very desirous to attach you to me, now that peace is signed between France and England, and you must tell me, according to a promise which you once made, what post I can give you at the court of France." Edward and Lucette looked at each other, and then, with his usual frankness, Edward answered, "No post your eminence can give me can attach me more strongly to you than that which you have already given me, the husband of this dear lady. 2 days ago we had a long consultation with our good friend Clement Tournon, and laid out our plans for life. He is resolved, with the sum he has amassed, to purchase a small and beautiful estate and château which he has seen not far from Paris, and Lucette and myself intend to live there a great part of each year as his son and daughter. We shall of course visit England from time to time, but our wish is to avoid courts and cities as much as may be." "Young people's dreams," said Richelieu gravely. "That may be," said Edward, "but I trust it will not prove so. However, if your eminence were to give me some high post, you would make many of the French nobilities dissatisfied, and you might find me ungrateful. But, as it is, I shall be near you the greater part of my days, and whether I may be in England or in France, if at any time I can serve you with my hand or my head or my heart, believe me, I will not forget these happy days are all owing to your great goodness." "I wish I could dream," said the cardinal, looking down thoughtfully. "It must be a very happy thing to be so confident of the world and of fate and of oneself. But be it so, Monsieur Langdale. Only remember—" "My lord, have I ever forgotten?" asked Edward. "No, no," said Richelieu, "and it is for that I have esteemed you. Come and see me when you are near Paris, for when I have a leisure hour I shall love your conversation. We will talk of art and literature and science, and I shall banish for that hour the thought of politics and intrigue and cabal. Oh, how I hate them! And if you have a son," he continued, laying his hand kindly upon that of Lucette as he rose to depart, "you shall call his name Armand." "And you shall bless him," cried Lucette warmly, kissing his hand, "and I will tell him that you made his father and myself happy. Perhaps in all his career of splendid misery, that was one of the happiest hours that Richelieu had ever experienced." The Prince de Soubise, as is well known, did not return to France and make his full submission to his king till Edward and Lucette had been married some time. To Edward, whom he met at the court not long after the final fall of Marie de Medici, he was polite and even friendly; but whether it was that he was naturally of a more haughty disposition than his brother the Duke de Rohan, or that he was never placed under the same pressure of circumstances, he refused to acknowledge, by any authentic act, the legality of the marriage between his young cousin and the son of one of his earliest friends. It made no difference to them, however, nor troubled their peace in the least; and in the end, after witnessing their mutual felicity for many years, both he and his brother the Duke, by their own wretched experience, were forced to acknowledge that a marriage of affection has more chance for happiness than a marriage of convenience. Still, however, with the same peculiar obduracy which had characterised his resistance to the crown in the hopeless war of the Protestants against Louis XIII., he refused to sign, on several occasions, the papers which were necessary to enable Lucette to enter fully into possession of her father's estates, saying that he would not recognise her marriage with the second son of a simple English gentleman. But his consent was passed over by certain forms of the Parliament, and as for Madame de Chevreuse, with her usual gay lightness, she signed her approbation of the marriage without a word of opposition, when she found that opposition would be vain. She was even inclined to be exceedingly kind and intimate with the young pair, but Edward gave no encouragement to her advances, and she satisfied herself by declaring that, like many of his countrymen, he was a handsome man, but somewhat brutal. In regard to Edward's claim to the estate of Buckley, there was no opposition, and he kept quiet possession during the whole of his life of that fine part of his inheritance. The estates of Langley were suffered to go greatly to decay for several years, the rents accumulating in the hands of the agent without ever being called for or paid over to anyone. How this property reverted to Edward himself, and how the objections of the Prince de Soubise to the marriage of his young cousin with Edward Langdale were at last done away, what was the ultimate fate of Sir Richard Langdale, and how an old proverb was verified, would be too long of telling in the pages which yet remain. Perhaps, if God spares the life, the health, and the senses of the author of this work, these particulars may all be related in another. At all events, the history of Lord Montagu's page is completed, for it would be folly to pursue that history in the calm, continued, uninterrupted happiness of his married life. Everyone has been unsuccessful in painting happiness with the pen. Dante failed in his Paradiso, Milton in his Paradise Regained, and the writer of these pages is not sufficiently presumptuous to suppose that he could succeed in representing a state as near as this world permits to that which they are attempted to picture in vain. The End. End of Chapter 51. End of Lord Montagu's Page by George Payne Rainsford James.